When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello and welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. In today's video, we are going to be continuing our Song of Ice and Fire reread. Let me change the page number real quick. Sometimes my brain doesn't work, but we're going to be doing Sansa 1 today. And this is actually the longest chapter I think we've actually done the entire story. This chapter, I've been saying this, I feel like a lot for the last couple chapters, is a very impactful chapter. A lot of these early on chapters, once we get kind of through the beginning part, are very important. We see a lot about Joffrey. This chapter, this one chapter for Sansa really shows and impacts and foreshadows her character arc as a whole throughout this, not only this book, but the rest of the books as a whole. And we see Arya, we get more character development for her and her differences with Sansa. And also we have the most important part of this chapter, the climax of this chapter, I would say, with basically Joffrey and Arya's fight and Nymeria eventually biting Joffrey. That's kind of the climax. And this chapter, I wanted to note because I didn't really realize this when I was reading it compared to, like, say, the show. This chapter takes a lot of ground. Like, there's a lot that we work towards, whether that's establishing new characters. For instance, we meet Barristan and Renly in this chapter as well. And also character building and also story/plot. So again, really love this chapter and all of that. So let's get into it on Sansa 1 on page 139. So the page begins with Sansa and Septa Mordane. They're eating breakfast, and we learn that Ned is off on a hunt with Robert. Seems like they're always hunting, or at least Robert is. That's what he loves to do. And Septa Mordane, to me, is one of those characters that I think the show made her a little bit more likable, like Catelyn, for instance. And she's just unpleasant. Like, Sansa is feeding Lady under the table, and Mordane is scolding Sansa. So this is one thing that I wanted to note with Arya 1. Arya 1, it felt like Mordane was specifically going after Arya. And in this chapter, she does go after Sansa, but it feels like it's only in private, where Mordane is not willing to embarrass Sansa in front of her peers. And yeah. And the other thing here is that Mordane does not really approve of the wolves. And we see this as a common trend for most people. Most people think this is very unnatural that the Starks have their wolves. And we'll kind of see how that continues with Sansa in this chapter. And Sansa kind of defends it, saying Ned said that we can keep them and that they are ours. And interesting enough, we have kind of a comparison here. And I think this is one thing that I don't think Arya and Sansa realize about each other, is that the two are very willful. We kind of see this with all of the Stark children to a degree, where when they want something or they're set in their way about something, it's very hard to move them off of that. Whether that's Robb, whether that's Sansa, whether that's Arya. For instance, Sansa is very stark in her defense of Joffrey, of the Queen. And even in the Wolves, and this is what Mordane is talking about, is that Mordane says that when it comes to the Wolves, you are as willful as Arya. And that's very true, and I think they just have different aspects of where they choose to be willful and other aspects where they aren't as much. Now, to end this page, we learn that Arya has not come to breakfast and that she is skipped and probably found food elsewhere. We see this as a common trend, that Arya is much more acquainted with maybe the lower class people, where she takes more of an interest in people in general, where Sansa isn't that way. Sansa really cares about either the highborn or knights or people of high birth. And we see that class system present directly within Sansa, where with Arya, it's not really. Arya doesn't mind going to the kitchens and, getting her own food, whereas Sansa gets hers probably from a servant. So again, showing the differences without Arya even in the room. And that's going to get us into page 140. So, page 140 starts with Mordane kind of telling Sansa that they're going to be traveling with the Queen. So, again, they need to look their best and that they need to be behaved, and especially Arya. Sansa is kind of told that she needs to make sure Arya dresses nicely and all that. And what I think is interesting is that Sansa in her head, and Sansa is this character that I think is very proud of herself and her looks and all of these things, that she already thinks she looks her best. And she is very eager to be in a position to, one, interact with Joffrey, but also to be with the royal family. And again, we see how young and naive Sansa is, as she already talks about being in love with Joffrey because he's tall and handsome and strong. Now, this is something that's interesting about Joffrey, is that we don't really ever see anyone say that Joffrey is strong. Yes, we've been told that, yes, he's tall and handsome, and he's got this blonde hair, but no one ever really considers that he's strong. No one says that. Like, when Jon describes him, doesn't describe him like that. It's very interesting the way that Sansa thinks this. So is this Sansa kind of just thinking that he's strong? Or is Joffrey actually strong? Because we know when it comes to his fight with Arya, he is awful. Like, when we get to that, I'm gonna like really talk about how Joffrey is such a bad swordsman when you think about it, but we'll get there when we get there. And more interesting is the idea that she is wary of what Arya will do, and that she is a wild card and prone to ruin everything. So again, we get the idea that Arya is not this person that is well behaved or will like be a normal lady. It's that idea that Sansa is, again, I've talked about this a lot, especially in Arya 1, where Sansa is the quintessential what a woman is supposed to be in this world. And Arya just doesn't fit into that mold, which makes her a big outcast. And, you know, I do kind of sympathize with Sansa to the degree of, in political situations, or when you think about Sansa being betrothed to Joffrey, Arya's behavior does make things much harder for Sansa to look good and to be like a fitting candidate for Joffrey. And again, I think Sansa's a hard character to judge based off of how young she is and how she's been brought up. She's very similar to Catelyn, in my opinion. And it's hard because Arya, again, is one of my favorite characters. I think for a lot of you is your favorite character. And a lot of times that can lead to Sansa being a very hated character, which, again, I don't personally like Sansa. But again, I do think she is understandable at times. And this prompts Sansa then be excused, which she is then allowed to leave. And again, we kind of get a description here of where Sansa and the rest of the party, that they're at this tavern. And we note that only really a third of the people actually were able to fit in the tavern. The rest just kind of had to camp around it. And we note now that the camp is being taken down, so they're kind of preparing for the next ride and to march on. Again, like we talked about with Sansa going in the wheelhouse, and eventually she finds Arya on the banks of the Trident brushing out Nymeria. Now, something I really want to point out as I go through this little interaction between Arya and Sansa is that the two direwolves directly show the two characters, where when we see Arya this entire time that they're talking and Arya's just trying to brush out Nymeria and scrape like the mud off of her fur or pelt, we notice that Nymeria is squirming a lot, not sitting down or staying still. And we note how Lady is the exact opposite. Lady is very much just sitting there, looking very ladylike and not really being wild at all. So again, that's something I did want to show. Now, another thing that's interesting here is that Sansa notes that Arya is in the same riding clothes from yesterday and the day before. Again, showing polar opposites, that Arya doesn't really care about her appearance, where Sansa cares about it a lot. That's one of her big things. As a lady, you want to look your best, you want to look beautiful, because again, in this world, the biggest part of a woman's life, and it's something that's touched on a lot in House of the Dragon in this world, is marrying and having kids. That goes for medieval times, like Renaissance times. That's a huge point of a woman's life. So if you're like Arya, looking ugly, looking dirty, looking like you are not a fitting candidate of a wedding or having kids, then you are quote unquote useless in this world as a woman based on these standards. And that's going to lead us into page 141. And I wanted to build off that point that I ended on. And when you look at Sansa, a lot of her character is kind of about that. When we see things like Sansa, when later her betrothal from Joffrey is taken away, it's not even really what Sansa does. It's, is she a good marriage candidate for Joffrey? And that becomes and that's based off the actions of her father and also a better arrangement with Marjorie. So that gets us into page 141. And we see the differences where Sansa cares a lot about riding with the queen, where Arya could care less. Arya doesn't want to be in this dull wheelhouse where you can't see anything with when you're with these kind of dull people like Myrcella. That's how Arya views her anyway. And why do that when Arya, who again is a character that's only lived kind of up in the north at Winterfell, has never gone this far down south, she wants to explore these things. She doesn't want to be, pent up. And she basically says that she wants to go ride with Micah to look for Rhaegar's rubies on the Trident. Now, this is another thing I want to note that I think is very key. And Sansa, I won't sit here and say that she's a stupid character, but we see like the idea of the differences between street smart and book smart. And even then, you give Arya a bit of the book smarts when it comes to Sansa doesn't even really know what Arya's talking about when it's about the rubies, because Arya kind of just says, we want to go look for rubies, and Sansa's like, rubies? So what do you mean? And then Arya has to explain it to her that those are from Rhaegar's breastplate. So again, things like that make Arya very interesting, that she studies and cares a lot about history, where Sansa doesn't really seem to be that kind of a character. And again, Sansa gets upset because the queen invited them both, and it's going to kind of look weird if Arya doesn't show up. It's going to be a sign of kind of disrespect, especially when you look at someone as, I guess, prickly as Cersei. She's very similar to someone like Walder Frey in that, where she doesn't take those little slights well. And again, she refuses to go, saying she wants to see the land. And Sansa is weird because she basically says, like, what do you want to see? It's just, trees, this or that. There's a house, a farm every once in a while. There's nothing really to see. And again, shows you the differences between the two characters, where Sansa doesn't care about stuff like that, where Arya does. Arya wants to see the land. She wants to see the caves or the holdfasts that they're going past, and she wants to explore the Trident. And again, it's going to be interesting because we see that right now, this is very important to note, Sansa doesn't care about these things, right? She doesn't care. And also, another thing is that Arya wants to ride, which is something Sansa doesn't like. Sansa doesn't like to ride. She doesn't like to get dirty. She doesn't like to get sore from riding a horse. All very important things to remember when later on she goes off with Joffrey. And again, the one thing I really love about this page specifically is we get a really great idea of the neck and what this region's layout and the conditions that are here. It's so difficult to attack because that there are snakes and quicksand everywhere. There is no place to camp besides the King's Road, and even then, it's extremely narrow. The air is damp. Again, it just shows how awful it would be to try and siege this area from the south. And when I talk about, like, in my video where Ned or maybe even Rob could, in my video about Robert, if he would have tried to kill Jon Snow, if Ned would have hid up in the north and just defended Moat Cailin, you have to think about these conditions, how many men Robert would have to lose to even maybe take it, because of how unforgiving it is, and it's what makes the north pretty much just unsiegeable. And that's going to lead us into the last little part of this page, and we see how Sansa disapproves of the way her father treats Arya, where I think Sansa believes that Ned should act like Mordain, where Mordain is willing to condemn all of these things that Arya does that aren't ladylike, but Ned isn't like that with Arya. And because we know that Ned kind of sees Lyanna and Arya, and that's kind of why Sansa doesn't really get that. Because we see that Arya, the day before, had been picking all of these flowers, and she gives Ned all of these different types of flowers, and Ned accepts it, hugs her and thanks her and does all these things. And Sansa just keeps expecting him to stop her from being foolish. And when he doesn't, it kind of, and what Sansa's getting at that is that it enables her to keep doing these things, which she's not wrong on that logic, but there's really nothing wrong with what Arya's doing, is kind of what Ned is trying to say, right? There's different types of people in this world. Not all of them need to be just like you, Sansa. And I think that's a normal kid thing. I think when you're younger and you're a kid, you expect everyone to be like you. I mean, for instance, me, right? I'll give an example just to relate to Sansa in this moment. I grew up being very religious. Like, I went to church. My mom and dad always made me go to church every Sunday. So I grew up kind of thinking, oh, if you didn't do that, that was, kind of weird. Like, why didn't you do that? Or if you didn't believe in my religion, that was kind of weird, because from a young age, that's just how you are as a kid. And I think that's what Sansa really is at this moment. And that's going to lead us into page 142. Also, guys, I got a new haircut. Do you guys like the haircut? Yes or no? Let me know down in the comments. You like the haircut or not? But getting off topic, let's get into it. So page 142, Sansa then notes that, again, Arya, because she went to pick these flowers, she also gets a bunch of rashes and how she is bruised in places. And again, it's kind of, again, George playing on this idea that Arya doesn't really care about getting dirty or taking injuries as long as she's having fun and getting to explore and do all these things, where Sansa just can't really comprehend that idea. And again, the rest of this page is really like Sansa and Arya just going back and forth about why she should go into the wheelhouse, and Arya just is not really having it. We also learn, like I had talked about a little bit earlier, is that, again, Arya likes to talk to the people in the column, not just the highborn people. Like, she'll go and talk to the lowest of the low. She's willing to make friends with Micah the butcher's boy, who, again, makes Sansa sick to even look at. Again, shows the class system with Sansa. She is on full display. Like, she doesn't even want to talk to someone that butchers meat. Again, not one of Sansa's greatest qualities. Now, Sansa, again, tries to convince Arya to join the wheelhouse, and Sansa believes at this moment she's being very reasonable and adult-like. And to a degree, I kind of agree with her. Like, she is being very reasonable. Like, she's not, like, forcing Arya or doing anything. Like, she's not being, like, childish about it at the moment. But at the same time, she's not kind of taking a step back and realizing that her sister's just not going to do this. It's just not Arya, and that's okay. Arya can be a different person and be kind of a tomboy type. Sansa just isn't really willing to understand that. And Sansa is this person that she very much feels like she thinks she's an adult way before she is. She's one of those people that, or maybe not, I think everybody goes through this at some point, where you get to a certain point of your life and you feel like you're old enough to now start being an adult, when in reality you're just not. I mean, I think if I look back at my life and I go back to when I was 17, 18, I thought, I knew a lot about the world, and I, was an adult and all these things, and I definitely wasn't. I made really stupid, maybe not mistakes, but let's just say, like, life choices, I guess. And I think that's kind of how Sansa is as a character. I think Sansa's a person that, when she looks back at herself, whether we're in Dance or Winds of Winter, she looks back on these decisions and she's like, what were you thinking? And I think a lot of us can really resonate with that aspect of Sansa's character. Sansa even kind of tries to bribe her sister, saying there's going to be sweets and cakes for her. But again, I just don't think Sansa understands Arya, like, at all. Like, these are things that would motivate Sansa, not Arya. Arya doesn't care about that. Like, we just got done talking about how Arya just didn't eat breakfast with them. Like, she just found her own food because she didn't care. So again, it just kind of really shows that Sansa doesn't really know her sister as well as maybe she thinks she does. Also, Arya is kind of upset that Cersei's not going to allow Nymeria, which again, we see people just don't like the wolves outside of the Starks, which I think does make sense. Like, how would you feel about having a wolf like in very close proximity to, say, your children? Especially when you're Cersei and you think about the Starks' loyalties, right? With her already suspecting Ned is coming south for an agenda. Like, again, I don't really blame Cersei in that mood on that point. And also, we have the idea that Myrcella is afraid of the wolves, which, again, young kid afraid of literally a wolf. Can't blame her. Now, I wanted to note here that, like I had talked about earlier, that the wolves act like their owners. Lady is very civil and obedient, while Nymeria is not obedient. She's very much squirming a lot, not really letting Arya comb her as well as she would like. And at this point, Sansa gives up, and she says that Arya is acting like a child, which they're both acting like children, because they are children. And it's that one idea where Theon jokes about in Arya 1, where Robb and Joffrey are, basically debating like they're not children and all this. And Theon's like, well, you are children. It's kind of that whole idea where it's like Arya is a child. And I think Sansa just feels like she's better than Arya when she really isn't. And Arya, like always, gets the last clap back and says, she's not going to let you take Lady either, Sansa, which is perfectly true. And Sansa has no reply, and she walks back to the tavern. And that leads us into page 143. And again, like I talked about, on the way back to this tavern, Sansa is kind of thinking about the way Arya is acting and how the two are so different. But what she once thought, and I think is really interesting, is that she once asked her mother, Catelyn, if Arya was a bastard, because again, she looks exactly like Jon and Ned, but she doesn't have really any of Catelyn in her. And also, she doesn't really act like Catelyn does. She doesn't act very ladylike. Arya and her mother are very different, which I think if we look at Winds of Winter and make predictions there, the two have actually gotten a lot more similar. Both are seeking revenge, as Catelyn is Stoneheart now, and Arya has turned into this like assassin type, hell-bent on revenge and things like that. The two have become very similar later in life, whereas at this point of the story, they're actually polar opposites. And again, this will get us further in as she gets back to kind of the main area, and she notices that there's a crowd, and she learns that people have arrived to be a quote-unquote honor guard to escort them the rest of the way. Also, my bad. We're actually on page 144, not 143. So that is my bad. We are now on page 144. So we see as she gets towards the center of the crowd that she finds, again, she doesn't know who these people are initially, but we know them as Barristan the Bold and Renly. They are kneeling before the queen. And the way that Sansa describes these two characters is quite fascinating because, again, we don't see many times in this story where people are meeting Renly and Barristan for kind of like the first time. So this is Sansa's idea of what those two characters are. She notes that Barristan looks old, but that there is still a strength to him. So he gives off this presence that, yes, he is older, but he's still very strong. He's someone that's still very competent in his older age. And what I think is even more interesting is the way Sansa sees Renly. Sansa sees Renly and she thinks he is the most handsome man she has ever seen. Again, proves why Renly is so popular. One, because he looks a lot like Robert, and two, he's extremely handsome. And again, we know that even from real world where we are right now, if you are really handsome or pretty, you will get a certain amount of privilege. And that's what we do see with Renly here, is that idea. And what I really love is we get the introduction to his helmet, his amazing antler helmet. He's also wearing a deep green, and that will get us into page 145. So 145 continues, and she notices that there's a third person, but he's kind of standing off to the side. And again, we know that that is Ilyn Payne. Sansa does not at the moment, but he seems older, but not as old as Barristan, which again, we know is true. He is wearing very plain armor and has a huge two-handed greatsword. Now, this is what I mean when you think of someone like Arya. I think Arya would be able to actually put together who at least this person is actually quite quickly, just based upon his demeanor. But Sansa to me is someone that just doesn't pick up on these things that well. And she notices that she can't really take her eyes off Payne. And suddenly he looks at her. And then this frightens her because Ilyn Payne is someone that is very intimidating. He's someone that, again, like Cersei mentions in this chapter, he's supposed to be fearsome, or, again, to put into the idea that people won't commit crimes because of him. And even when this is happening, Lady starts to growl because of Sansa's distress. Because, again, the direwolves are almost directly linked to the Starks. And she kind of starts to back up, and she runs into probably the second scariest guy to run into, the Hound, who, again, isn't very gentle with her. He, like, pulls her around and noting how she's shaking and if he frightens her so. To which she responds, no. And funny enough, it's not really the Hound that scares her, it's Ilyn Payne, which I think, and again, in this moment, as Sansa tries to back away from the Hound, Lady then gets in between them. Again, Lady is going off of the emotions of Sansa, and Lady starts to growl and get kind of aggressive. Sansa then goes to the ground to calm her down, and she begins to cry because, again, she's made a big scene here, and everyone's surrounding her, and people are kind of like poking fun at her and questioning why the wolf is here. Like, that's not a pet you should have, which, again, I think very understandable. And at this moment, Cersei tells Joffrey to go to her. Now, this is the one thing that I want to point out with this chapter compared to the way the show framed Joffrey and Sansa's relationship early on. Because from Sansa's point of view, when you look at all the things that happen in this chapter, you can really understand why Sansa views Joffrey one way. Because Joffrey is kind of putting on an act, and we don't give Joffrey as much credit as maybe he deserves, because in this early portion where he's quote-unquote, you would call it courting Sansa, he does a very good job. He plays this role of the young, handsome prince that saves the woman, or Sansa, from these monsters, the Hound and Ilyn Payne. And Cersei sets him up to do that really well, and that's why I think Sansa struggles with her allegiance when it comes to later in the next chapter with Ned, on whether to take Joffrey or Arya's side. And that kind of gets us into 146, and Joffrey's going to kind of continue that. Joffrey kind of comes in, and again, he plays this role really well. He basically says everyone needs to back up, put their swords away, and that the wolf is her pet. And he also helps Sansa rise, and he tells the Hound to go away, as he is scaring Sansa. And Sansa says that it actually wasn't the Hound, it was Payne. And again, she doesn't know who this is. She says it was that guy over there. To which Renly chuckles. And again, this is just Renly's nature. He's someone that doesn't take things very seriously. He tends to kind of laugh or just basically jest about things. But Barristan is a bit more kind, saying he does have a fearsome aspect to him. And again, like I talked about, and they introduce who Payne is, but the Queen basically says people need to fear him. He is the justice. And again, Sansa kind of kicks into gear here at this point. She's kind of found herself, and she's able to do what she's good at, right? This is the thing that kind of keeps her alive in King's Landing, is her courtesies and words, things that are kind of expected of her, as she makes a joke of Cersei's comments and graciously praises Barristan. All things that she does very well. Renly then laughs as he calls Barristan old and tries to see if Sansa can guess his name right. Because again, Sansa kind of figures out who Barristan is at this point, and now Renly is like, well, if you can find out my name, then you truly are the Hand's daughter. And that'll continue into 147. And unsurprisingly, Sansa is able to figure out that this is Renly, which I feel like should be pretty obvious. I mean, Renly and Robert pretty much look the exact same. Just Renly's just a younger and better looking version of Robert. Also, the antler helm is a dead giveaway, like Sansa notes. So again, she kind of figures this out. And at this moment, Pain approaches. Now, Sansa, again, doesn't know who this person is, doesn't know their history, apologizes, but Pain says nothing. And Sansa is like, did I offend him? Like, what happened? And we learned through a bit of dialogue from Renly and Joffrey that he lost his tongue to Aerys. So he's not going to be talking very much. And we also note that something that's very key here is we note how Joffrey does not like Renly. It's made very obvious by George because he notes that Joffrey gives Renly a look of loathing. He doesn't enjoy Renly at all. Now, Cersei at this point basically wants to have some sort of council with Renly and Barristan and postpones the ride with Myrcella and her, and she asks that Joffrey escort Sansa. Now, this is perfect, again, for a lot of reasons for Sansa and Joffrey, because Joffrey's now going to get the time to be the gallant prince who gets to escort her around, and this is perfect. This is exactly what Sansa wants, alone time with Joffrey. That's kind of the whole reason that she wanted to go on this little wheelhouse ride, was to be closer to Joffrey if possible. Now, I want to notice, again, there's a very big difference between show and book Joffrey, where I think it's a bit more understanding as to why Sansa does have those feelings for Joffrey, whereas in the show it's not really made abundantly clear why she does, outside of just he is cute to Sansa. And that gets us into the last back half of this chapter. Page 148 will be the start, but this will be kind of Sansa and Joffrey wandering around until they meet Arya. So, Sansa notes how happy she is to have a whole day with Joffrey, but this is where, in my opinion, it gets interesting, because we see how people will change their beliefs to get what they want, and Sansa really is no different in that idea. Now, it is kind of a minor scale, and I think a lot of us will do this, where you have somebody you like and you'll change your beliefs because it's what they like. It's something that we shouldn't do, but it is something that Sansa does fall for here. And Sansa basically is like, she's just happy to be here. She's like, Joffrey, we can pretty much do whatever you want. And Joffrey says, let's go riding. To which Sansa replies, I love riding. Which again, if we go back to her conversation with Arya, Sansa specifically says she doesn't like to ride because it gets her dirty and sore. So again, we see how that switches up when it comes to riding with Joffrey. And then Joffrey, I think, does something that is a little bit cocky, but at the same time, you can kind of understand. He's this kid that thinks he's a man now at this point, that he doesn't need this protection. And he basically asks Sansa to leave Lady because Lady may scare the horses, which I don't know about that, because yes, they might Lady might freak out the horses a little, but Lady also does travel with the column already, so some of the horses would probably be accustomed to Lady. But sure. And also, Joffrey says that if they do that, he'll also leave the Hound behind. Now, Sansa, in my opinion, makes her first mistake with Joffrey, where she questions Joffrey and says, is this safe, leaving the Hound behind? And Joffrey is just annoyed by this. How could you question, A, my authority and me as a person, and 2, are you questioning if I'm a man or not? He says he is a man grown as he shows her his sword, Lion Tooth, while he also, again, interesting, insults Sansa's brothers at the same time, saying that, unlike your brothers, I don't play with wooden swords. Again, Sansa doesn't really pick up on that, though. Like, in Sansa's head, she doesn't even, recognize that he says that. But again, Sansa does have a little bit of a misstep here with the courting of Joffrey when she says something like that, which we know is not good to say towards someone like Joffrey. This gets us into page 149, and this is going to be them just heading out and exploring. And again, they do exactly what Arya is doing, and that's what I think is so funny, is how Sansa is kind of belittling Arya's approach and saying she's so childish, while then she spends the day doing the exact same thing that Arya more or less was going to do. And so this basically happens, and the two start exploring. They run into a holdfast, and they explore, I think, a cave and some other stuff. But we see how privileged Joffrey is, where he gets whatever he wants. That's how it's always been his entire life. He just basically rocks up to a holdfast and demands they give him food and wine for him and Sansa. And again, he drinks a lot. And Sansa, who is not accustomed to drinking, says that she never is really able to, or she's only able to in small amounts because of her father. And Joffrey says that basically it doesn't matter. He is with her. Again, it's an interesting idea because Joffrey's showing that rebellious side, and women seem to love that, especially in this world. So Sansa is definitely a fan. And as it's getting late, we also see another thing that was not in the show that I think goes a long way to understanding why Sansa likes Joffrey. Joffrey begins to sing, something that is not really present much else in the story, but he starts to sing for Sansa, and Sansa even notes that he has a good voice. But at this point, it's starting to get late, and Sansa thinks that they should turn back. But Joffrey, very similar to Arya, wants to see where Robert killed Rhaegar. Again, showing exactly that Sansa, who found herself not liking what Arya was doing, thought it was childish, is doing the exact same thing as Arya in this moment. But there's a great contrast, because if we look at Catelyn 3, Robb has this moment where he pulls out his sword and like is acting like he's going to go to war, and then is instantly told, stop that and don't do that. And Joffrey does the same thing here, but we see the difference. Where Robb is restrained and is being taught how to be a man, Joffrey kind of whips out his sword and acts like he is swinging Robert's warhammer, and he bears his steel eagerly, and no one tells him differently. It shows how parents are such a big thing, and who you're surrounded by will define who you grow up as. Will you be a spoiled individual like Joffrey, who's a brat and no one tells him no? Or will you be more like Robb, someone that does have fairly good parenting and will kind of grow into a good person for the most part? And that leads us to this moment where Joffrey hears something, and Joffrey wants to know what it is. And this will lead us into the scene of Arya and Micah playing with swords. And as the two approach, Joffrey kind of laughs, just noting how silly this looks, because Arya is this child that is in really bad clothing. She, to most people, if you didn't know who Arya was, looks probably like a peasant girl. And then you have her fighting with a wooden sword against the butcher's boy. You can see from Joffrey's point of view why this is very funny, because again, he is someone that does not like the lower class, does not believe they should be knights or playing like they're knights. And Joffrey notes that this is Sansa's sister and wants to know who the boy is. We find out that this is Micah. And we again see how drunk Joffrey is that he states Micah wants to be a knight and Joffrey wants to see how good he is. So he's basically going to try to fight him with a castle-forged sword against a wooden stick. And again, Micah just starts like doing what I think any person would do in his situation, where he's like, this is a stick, and that Arya asked me to do this, you know, like all of these things. And Joffrey just keeps going, saying, you know, let's test it. And eventually it gets to this point where Joffrey goes, you are no knight, as he puts the blade on Micah's cheek. And this gets us into page 151. So Joffrey then, while having the sword on Micah's cheek, starts to kind of cut him. Arya tries to tell him to stop, and Joffrey says he won't hurt him much in his sadistic voice. And then Arya, just having enough with it, picks up her stick, hits him over the back of the head. So, I mean, a good place to hit. If you're Arya, you're undersized, you get a good hit on him. And I will say, like, this is one of the scenes that they did really well in the show where it's fairly accurate. Let me change kind of the image as well. I'm a real big fan of this image, and I think you guys are as well. But again, we then see as Joffrey whirls around and he blocks her next attack, and he then starts to just basically attacking her violently, cursing loudly, and he breaks her sword at one point. But I want you to think about it like this. Arya has a wooden stick and is now disarmed, and Joffrey is struggling to hit her with his sword. It shows you how incompetent Joffrey is with a sword. And like, if he actually would have had to fight at the Battle of the Blackwater, oh, he would have been such toast. But eventually, Arya is just kind of backing away, and all while Sansa is worried that Arya is ruining her perfect day. Again, note how she says that Arya is ruining her perfect day, not Joffrey. Joffrey is the one that imposes on Arya's time here, and is the one that is aggressing on this, literally, physically abusing Micah. And now he's active. He's in the active, while Sansa's thinking about this, is actively trying to kill, or at least harm Arya really badly. And Sansa can only worry about her perfect day and her relationship with Joffrey. Now, during this time, Micah then also flees while this is all going on. And Arya is just frightened. Joffrey has a sword. He's approaching her. And Sansa is crying when something like a blur goes past. And I love this because, again, very similar to Catelyn 3, where Catelyn notes that like a blur goes past. And then, bam, all of a sudden the cat's paw is on the ground. Very similar here, where just like a bolt of lightning. And bam, Nymeria has got a hold of Joffrey's sword arm and bringing him to the ground until Arya finally gets Nymeria off of him and she gets Joffrey's sword. Now, this is a very interesting scene now because Arya now has Joffrey's sword and is kind of standing over him with the sword pointed at him. And we see Joffrey plead to Arya, saying that he will tell his mother. And Arya notes that Nymeria didn't even hurt you that bad, right? Because that's the thing. Nymeria did not, like, tear his wrist or his arm out. Like, he can still move it around, and he's able to, like, Nymeria could have done much worse to Joffrey if, say, she had just went for the throat, killed Joffrey then and there. Like, it could have been much worse. But again, we're left on page 151 with kind of a cliffhanger for the last page. And like, it's basically a half a page. Where is Arya going to kill Joffrey in this moment? Now, obviously, we know that's not going to happen because if we did that, we wouldn't really have a story. But again, this is even more questionable from Sansa, is that Sansa defends Joffrey in this moment in saying to leave him alone. This dude literally tried to kill your sister. Like, there's a lot of things you can kind of rationalize with Sansa, and even in this moment, maybe she's blinded by her love of Joffrey, which I guess is the explanation. But, man, like, that is a really bad interpretation of events that just happened, and it's just more foreshadowing to what Sansa's going to do later on in the next Ned chapter. So then Arya, she just kind of throws Joffrey's sword into the water and retreats with Nymeria into the forest. And this is when the complete facade comes down from Joffrey. Because at this point, at least Joffrey has only been kind of an ass to other people, not Sansa. But at this moment, Sansa's trying to, like, calm Joffrey down. She's trying to going over to him, saying that she's going to get some help and everything's going to be okay. And Joffrey basically goes, then go and don't touch me. In the Jack Gleason voice. And it's like, whoa, that should have been a big wake-up call for Sansa. But in reality, it's not. Like, she still holds on to the idea of marrying Joffrey and having his babies, as we'll see later on. It's amazing how much and how many red flags Sansa just looks over. Like, right now, like, Sansa's going to sit in there, and she's just getting red flag thrown at her from left and right, and she's just dodging them. She's just like this, just dodging all them red flags. But yeah, that is the end of the chapter. Now, I don't know if this is the longest video of the series so far. I know it's going to be kind of close, but I believe this is the longest chapter so far of the book. And it's a pretty good one. It's pretty action-packed towards the back. A lot of introductions into amazing characters. And some great character dynamics, whether that's building Joffrey's character, Sansa's character, Arya's character, even Barristan and Renly's, and a little bit of Cersei as well. So thank you guys all for watching, and I'll see you guys all in the next video. Bye, guys.